The sound of tires crunching on the gravel road broke the silence as I drove deeper into the woods. The narrow trail twisted through dense trees that seemed to close in on me as I made my way toward the cabin. I had been looking forward to this weekend getaway for months. My name is Mike, and I'm 32 years old, working a job that left me constantly stressed out. I had told my friends I was going to take a break, get away from everything, and just relax. I had never been to this cabin before, but it was supposed to be the perfect place for solitude. The sky was overcast as I pulled up to the cabin. It stood alone, surrounded by tall pine trees, with no other buildings in sight. The air was crisp, and the smell of wet pine filled my nose as I stepped out of the car. There was something quiet about it, a stillness that made the hairs on the back of my neck stand up. I shrugged it off. It was just the wilderness. I had spent a lot of time in the woods before. This would be no different. I grabbed my duffel bag from the back seat and walked up to the cabin, the wooden steps creaking under my weight. The front door was unlocked, which struck me as odd, but I didn't give it much thought. I had rented the place after all. Inside, the cabin smelled like old wood and campfire. It wasn't unpleasant, but it felt a little musty. There was a large stone fireplace against one wall, a few mismatched chairs scattered around, and an old wooden table in the center of the room. The furniture looked like it hadn't been touched in years. I took a deep breath and set my bag down on one of the chairs. The windows were all covered with thick curtains, making the place feel dark despite the afternoon light outside. I drew the curtains back from one of the windows and looked out at the dense forest. It stretched for miles, and I could barely see the sky through the thick canopy of trees. The cabin was simple, but it had everything I needed. A small kitchen with an old stove and refrigerator, a bathroom that looked like it had been renovated recently, and a small bedroom with a bed covered in a patchwork quilt. I unpacked my things, hanging up a few clothes, setting up a small stack of books on the table, and putting my laptop on the nightstand. The first night was uneventful. I cooked some canned food I had brought with me and spent the evening reading by the fire. The only sound was the occasional crackling of the fire and the wind howling outside. It was peaceful, which was exactly what I needed. I eventually went to bed and fell into a deep sleep, undisturbed by any noise or interruptions. The next morning, I woke up to the smell of fresh coffee. The cabin was still quiet, the only sound being the occasional creak of the wooden beams above. I went into the kitchen and made myself some breakfast, thinking about going for a hike later in the day. The weather was still overcast, but the clouds had parted slightly, allowing a little bit of sunlight to peek through. After breakfast, I grabbed my jacket and headed outside. The air was chilly, but it felt good to stretch my legs after the long drive. I walked a little ways down the gravel road, then veered off onto a small trail that led deeper into the woods. I had no particular destination in mind, just wanted to take in the beauty of the surroundings. As I walked, I noticed how quiet it was. Too quiet. The only sounds were my footsteps crunching on the fallen leaves and the occasional bird call in the distance. No animals, no insects buzzing around, just an unnatural silence. I tried to shake off the feeling that something was off and continued on, but it was hard to ignore the way the woods seemed to close in around me. About an hour later, I turned back and headed toward the cabin. As I walked back, I felt the strange sensation that I was being watched. I couldn't shake it, no matter how much I told myself it was just the isolation playing tricks on me. When I returned to the cabin, I immediately locked the door behind me. I didn't know why, but I felt better with it locked, even though I knew no one was around for miles. I spent the rest of the afternoon inside, trying to distract myself with my laptop and a book, but the uneasy feeling persisted. Every time I looked out the window, the trees seemed to be moving in a way that didn't seem natural. It was as if something was lurking just beyond the edge of the woods, watching me. It didn't make any sense, of course, but the feeling was there. As the evening approached, I decided to light a fire and relax by it. The flames crackled, and the warmth of the fire felt comforting. But no matter how much I tried to relax, I couldn't shake the feeling that something was wrong. It wasn't the cabin per se, but the feeling of isolation. There was no one for miles. No neighbors, no phone service, no internet. I was alone, completely alone. That night, I slept fitfully. I kept waking up, feeling like I was being watched. The shadows in the corners of the room seemed to move, and the creaking of the wooden beams kept me on edge. I told myself it was just the wind, but deep down, I knew something wasn't right. The next morning, I decided to leave. I packed up my things quickly, not wanting to stay another night in that place. As I was gathering my belongings, I heard a noise outside. It sounded like something was moving around the side of the cabin. I froze, heart pounding in my chest. I couldn't bring myself to look out the window, but I knew something was there. Something was out there. I grabbed my keys and hurried out the door, locking it behind me. I didn't care about anything anymore. I just needed to get out of there. The drive back to the main road felt like it took forever. I kept glancing in the rearview mirror, half expecting to see someone following me, but there was nothing. The woods remained silent, as they had been the entire time I had been there. By the time I reached the highway, I felt a sense of relief wash over me. I was out. I was safe. But something still lingered in the back of my mind, a nagging feeling that I couldn't quite place. I couldn't explain it, but I couldn't shake it either. It wasn't until I was home and unpacking my things that I found it. A small, crudely carved wooden figure hidden in the bottom of my duffel bag. It was shaped like a person, though it was far from lifelike. The figure was rough, the edges jagged, and there was something deeply unsettling about the way it had been made. It didn't belong in my bag. I hadn't packed it. I stared at the figure for a long time, trying to make sense of it. But I couldn't. I didn't want to think about it anymore. I didn't want to remember that cabin, the woods, the feeling that I wasn't alone. I couldn't explain it, but it didn't matter. I wasn't going back. That cabin, those woods, whatever they were better left behind. I threw the figure away, never to think about it again. But the nagging feeling, the sense of being watched, never really left. The first night alone in the cabin should have felt peaceful. That's what I kept telling myself when I stepped off the gravel road, pulled the door shut behind me, and felt the lock click into place. The kind of peace you never get in a city, the kind that comes from the silence of the forest, the way the trees seem to stand so still, almost as if they're watching. I'd rented the cabin for a week, with no intention of leaving early. No phone service, no interruptions, just me, a small fire, and the kind of stillness I thought I was craving. I'd spent months thinking about this trip. The idea of getting away, far from the noise of work, the pressure of social media, and the constant buzz of city life. The cabin was in a secluded area, tucked away in the thick woods of northern Minnesota. The cabin's owner, an older man named Hank, told me over the phone that the nearest town was a good hour's drive away. So if I needed anything, I'd have to drive myself. I was fine with that. I wanted isolation. I wanted quiet. The cabin itself was charming, if not a little run down. The wood creaked beneath my boots as I stepped across the old floorboards, the smell of pine and damp earth seeping through the walls. The living room had a small stone fireplace that looked like it hadn't been used in years. But I had no problem with that. The old leather armchair in front of it looked worn, but comfortable, and I couldn't help but sink into it, feeling the weight of the world lift off my shoulders. I'd brought enough food and supplies to last me for the week: canned goods, pasta, some fresh vegetables, a couple of steaks. Everything I needed to cook on the small stove or over the open fire outside. I'd also packed some books and my journal. The plan was simple: wake up, read, cook, hike, sleep, repeat. It seemed like the perfect way to recharge. The first day passed quickly. I spent the morning exploring the woods around the cabin. The forest was dense, with thick underbrush and towering pines. It was easy to lose track of time, and by the time I returned to the cabin, the sun was dipping low behind the trees. I built a fire outside, set up my camp chair, and sat down with a beer to watch the light fade into twilight. As the night deepened, the only sounds I could hear were the crackling of the fire, the occasional rustle of leaves, and the soft hoots of owls somewhere in the distance. But then, as I sat there, a strange sound caught my attention. It was faint at first, almost like a low whisper on the wind. It sounded like someone was walking on the gravel path that led to the cabin. I froze, straining my ears to listen. The sound didn't come from the road behind the cabin. It came from the woods, from the direction I just walked earlier. My heart skipped a beat, but I brushed it off. Could have been an animal or maybe a branch falling, something like that. Still, I felt uneasy. I glanced toward the trees, but the shadows were too thick to see anything clearly. After a moment, I stood up, grabbing the flashlight from the table. I scanned the area around the cabin, but there was nothing, just the dark woods, the flickering firelight, and the soft whispering of the wind. The sound stopped, and with it, my unease faded. I figured it was just my nerves, maybe the unfamiliar surroundings playing tricks on me. I hadn't been alone in a while after all. I went inside, locked the door, and settled in for the night. The fire inside crackled as I flipped through the pages of one of my books, the warmth of the flames easing the tension from my shoulders. But sleep didn't come easily. Every time I closed my eyes, I imagined the sound again, the footsteps in the woods, too close to be just the wind. My mind kept wandering, wondering if someone had been out there, watching the cabin. The second day was better. I took a long hike to the nearby lake, enjoying the peace of being alone. But the moment I returned, the unease returned with it. I couldn't shake the feeling that someone had been watching the cabin. My mind kept drifting back to the sound I'd heard the night before, but when I checked the area around the cabin, I saw no signs of anyone. That evening, I decided to go to bed early. I was tired from the hike and the unsettling thoughts, so I crawled under the thick blanket and tried to settle into the bed. As the night deepened, the wind picked up, howling through the trees, but I wasn't as disturbed by it anymore. The woods were alive at night, I reminded myself. The animals, the wind, it was all part of the experience. At least, that's what I told myself until I heard the footsteps again. This time, they were louder, closer. I bolted upright in bed, heart racing. The footsteps were unmistakable now. Someone was definitely walking outside the cabin, and they were getting closer. The gravel crunched beneath the weight of each step. My pulse quickened as I heard the soft rustling of leaves near the cabin's back door. I grabbed my flashlight and rushed to the window, pressing my face against the cool glass, straining to see anything in the dark. My hands were shaking, and my breath was shallow. The flashlight flickered as I turned it on, but all I could see was the swirling darkness of the forest. No figures, no movement. Then the sound stopped. Just like that, I spent the next hour sitting in the chair, the flashlight still clenched in my hand, staring into the blackness outside. I couldn't tell if I was waiting for something to happen or if I was too scared to sleep. But eventually, exhaustion won out, and I fell asleep in the chair, the beam of the flashlight cutting through the room like a lonely sentinel. The next day was a blur. I didn't leave the cabin, didn't feel safe enough to step outside. I checked the area around the cabin again, but found nothing unusual. No footprints, no signs of anyone being there. I started to convince myself that it was just my mind playing tricks, that I was alone in the woods after all. Yet, the feeling of being watched never left me. The days dragged on like that. Every night, the footsteps returned. Sometimes they were louder, sometimes they were quieter, but they were always there. Always coming from the direction of the trees, always getting closer. I stopped going outside after dark. The idea of walking the path back to the cabin in the pitch-black dark filled me with dread. It felt like someone was waiting, just out of sight, waiting for me to make a mistake. On the fourth day, the weather changed. A storm rolled in, heavy rain and strong winds that lashed against the windows of the cabin. It felt like the world outside had been swallowed whole by the storm, and I was trapped in the cabin with only the crackling fire and the sound of the rain to keep me company. As night fell, the storm only intensified, the wind howling through the trees like some wild animal. I stayed in the cabin, huddled near the fire, staring out the window at the sheets of rain. The footsteps had stopped completely, but something about the silence felt wrong. I couldn't shake the feeling that something was waiting, watching. I don't know what made me finally check the back door, but I did. I slowly approached the door, my fingers brushing against the handle, my breath caught in my throat. I had to know. I had to see if I was imagining it all. When I opened the door, I was met with the cold rush of rain. The wind whipped the water into my face, but as I stepped outside, my eyes went straight to the ground. There, in the mud near the back of the cabin, were fresh footprints. Large, heavy prints, the kind that didn't belong to any animal I recognized. They led off into the trees, disappearing into the dark woods. I could feel my heart hammering in my chest as I stared at the tracks. There was no doubt now. Someone had been out there watching me, but I wasn't alone anymore. I knew exactly what I had to do. I locked the door behind me, grabbed my gear, and ran for the car. It took everything I had to stay calm, to focus on getting out of there without making a sound, without looking back. I left the cabin behind in the rain and mud, speeding down the road away from the woods, away from the thing that had been watching me. By the time I reached the nearest town, I felt like I was finally safe. I spent the night in a cheap motel, still shaking from the adrenaline and fear. The next morning, I called Hank to tell him what had happened. He was quiet for a long time on the phone, and then, finally, he said, "I should have warned you. That place. It's been abandoned for years, but there's always someone nearby, always someone keeping an eye on it." It wasn't the storm, or the trees, or the footsteps that I would remember the most about that trip. It was the feeling of being watched, the sense that I was never truly alone, even when I thought I was. And I couldn't shake the feeling that I was never meant to stay there. It was late autumn when I decided to head up to the cabin. I'd been going through a rough patch in life, after some difficult personal setbacks, losing my job, a failed relationship, and a string of bad luck. I felt like I needed to get away from everything. Somewhere quiet, isolated, with no distractions. The cabin I rented was nestled deep in the woods, far from the nearest town, and it seemed like the perfect escape. The cabin itself was modest, a simple wooden structure with a slanted roof, set in a small clearing surrounded by towering pine trees. It wasn't luxurious by any means, but I didn't care. It had a wood-burning stove, a small kitchen with an old fridge, and a single room with a bed in the corner. Outside, there was a small porch that overlooked the dense forest. I'd rented it for a week, hoping that the solitude would help me clear my head. I arrived in the late afternoon, the sun already dipping behind the horizon. The air was crisp and smelled of earth and pine, a welcome change from the polluted city air. I unloaded my car, unpacking my things, a few clothes, some books, and a couple of cans of soup. The cabin was exactly what I expected, old, but functional. There was a strange stillness to the place, but I chalked it up to the isolation. The nearest neighbors were miles away. That first evening, I lit a fire in the stove and made myself a quick meal. The crackling of the fire was the only sound in the cabin, and it made me feel at ease. It was peaceful. After dinner, I sat by the fire, reading a book I'd brought along. I was exhausted from the drive and the emotional toll of the past few months, so I decided to turn in early. The bed was small but comfortable, and I quickly fell into a deep, dreamless sleep. The next morning, I woke up early. The sun had just risen, casting a soft orange glow through the trees outside. The air inside the cabin was cold, but the stove still had some embers from last night's fire. I threw a few more logs on the stove and made myself a cup of coffee. The stillness of the morning was beautiful. I had the entire day ahead of me to do whatever I wanted. Hike, read, maybe even explore the surrounding woods. I spent the first part of the morning walking through the forest. There were no trails, no markers, just trees and underbrush. The ground was soft with fallen leaves, and the air was still, broken only by the occasional rustle of a squirrel or the call of a bird. It was the kind of quiet I'd been longing for. There was something calming about being completely alone in the woods. As I wandered deeper into the forest, I began to notice that the trees felt different. The farther I walked, the thicker the forest became, and the sunlight had a harder time breaking through the dense canopy above. The woods had an odd, oppressive quality to them. It was hard to put my finger on it, but I felt like I was being watched, like there was something just out of sight. I tried to shake off the feeling. After all, I was alone in the woods, and it was just my mind playing tricks on me. But the feeling didn't go away. It stayed with me, growing stronger the deeper I went. Eventually, I decided to turn back. I had wandered far enough to know I didn't want to get lost, and my thoughts were becoming increasingly paranoid. I retraced my steps and made my way back toward the cabin. The feeling of being watched didn't fade, and I started to feel uncomfortable. When I returned to the cabin, I was relieved to be out of the woods. I made myself another cup of coffee and sat by the stove. My mind was racing. I couldn't shake the feeling that something was wrong, even though there was no logical reason to think so. I tried to relax, telling myself I was just overthinking things. But that night, as I lay in bed, I couldn't shake the sense of unease. The silence in the cabin was deafening, and every creak of the wooden floorboards, every gust of wind outside, made me tense up. The next few days followed a similar pattern. I spent my mornings hiking in the woods, exploring a little farther each day, but I always felt like something was off. The woods were always quiet, too quiet, and no matter how much I tried to push the feeling aside, I couldn't escape it. At night, I kept the fire going in the stove, the crackling of the wood being the only sound to break the silence. On the fourth day, things started to get strange. I woke up to find that the door to the cabin had been opened during the night. I was sure I'd locked it before going to bed, but there it was, slightly ajar. I stood frozen for a moment, staring at the door. My heart started racing. Maybe I'd forgotten to lock it, but no, I was certain I had. I stepped cautiously toward the door and peered outside. The air was still, the forest unchanged. Nothing looked out of place. I closed the door and locked it again, trying to calm myself. But the unease lingered, and I couldn't shake the feeling that someone, or something, had been inside. I tried to brush it off, but that evening, I noticed something else. There were tracks in the dirt near the cabin. Fresh footprints, leading toward the cabin from the woods. They were large, too large to be an animal's, and they weren't mine. I froze when I saw them, the blood draining from my face. Who else could be out here? The nearest neighbor was miles away, and I hadn't seen anyone since I arrived. I immediately went inside and locked the door again, but this time, I didn't feel safe. My thoughts were racing. I had to leave. I should have packed up and driven away that very moment. But a strange sense of dread kept me rooted in place. I couldn't explain it, but the idea of leaving didn't feel right. Instead, I decided to wait. I stayed up late that night, keeping a vigilant watch, my eyes constantly scanning the darkness outside the cabin's windows. The night was unbearably quiet. I barely slept, and every small sound made me jump. Around 3 a.m., I heard something, a faint tapping at the door. It was so quiet that I wasn't sure if I had imagined it. I waited, holding my breath, but there it was again, a soft, rhythmic tapping. My heart pounded in my chest as I got out of bed, creeping toward the door. I stood there for what felt like an eternity, listening for any further sounds. But there was nothing, no more tapping. The silence seemed to stretch on, thick and oppressive. Eventually, I mustered the courage to open the door a crack. I peered outside, but there was nothing there. No person, no animal. The forest stood still under the dim light of the moon, and the air was thick with the scent of pine. It was so quiet, it felt unnatural. I closed the door quickly and locked it again. My hands were shaking. I didn't know what to think anymore. I didn't know if someone was out there, or if I was simply losing my mind. The next day, I decided to leave. I packed up my things, my heart still racing with the adrenaline of fear. As I was about to head out, I noticed something strange. There were more footprints near the cabin, but these ones were closer. They led right up to the porch. I didn't know what to think, but I didn't want to find out. I got in my car, started the engine, and drove away without looking back. As I drove down the winding road, I felt a weight lifting off my shoulders. The farther I got from the cabin, the lighter I felt. By the time I reached the nearest town, the unease had started to fade, but I still couldn't shake the feeling that something had been wrong. I never went back to that cabin, and even now, as I sit here writing this, I can still remember the feeling of being watched, the eerie silence, and the unmistakable sense that something was lurking just beyond the trees. In the end, I got what I needed from that trip: isolation, peace, and the space to think. But I also learned something else: that some places are better left unexplored. Some silence is too heavy, and some woods are too quiet. The cabin may have given me the escape I wanted, but in the end, it was the very place that made me realize that sometimes the most frightening thing is not what you see, but what you can't. The trees were dense here. I could see how easily anyone could get lost in the forest. I was 26, and this cabin, this tiny old cabin in the middle of nowhere, was my escape for the weekend. I'd been working long hours at a desk job, and the idea of getting away from it all for a couple of days seemed like the only way I could unwind. The cabin wasn't much, but that's part of its charm. It was the kind of place you could forget about the hustle and bustle of life, get some fresh air, and just breathe. No Wi-Fi, no phone signal, no distractions. Just me, the wilderness, and a few days of silence. I arrived at the cabin late in the afternoon, just before the sun started to dip behind the trees. The air was already cooling, and the faint smell of pine filled my nose. I parked the car in the small clearing just beyond the cabin's porch, grabbed my backpack, and made my way inside. The place was even more rustic than I expected. The floors creaked under my feet as I stepped inside. It had that old, musty smell, mixed with wood and the faint trace of mildew. There were wooden beams overhead, a simple stone fireplace in the corner, and a set of windows that looked out over a small, overgrown yard and the forest beyond. It felt remote, cut off from the rest of the world. I wasn't sure why, but I felt a little uneasy. Maybe it was the isolation, or maybe just the thought of being alone in a place this far out in the woods. I shoved it aside. This was what I wanted: quiet, solitude. The only company was the trees and the sound of the wind. I unpacked my things, hung my jacket on a hook by the door, and decided to make a fire. It took a while, but eventually, the crackling flames filled the space with warmth. I sat in front of the fire, trying to relax. My body was still tense from the week's stress, but as the night deepened, I felt myself slowly starting to unwind. I set up a few candles around the room for light. The flickering flame was soothing, and the cabin felt more like a retreat. The first night was peaceful, the kind of stillness that feels deep in your bones. I made myself some instant noodles, and after dinner, I sat by the fire for a while longer, watching the flames dance. Eventually, the sound of the wind outside started to lull me to sleep. I grabbed an old blanket from the couch and laid down on the floor, near the fire but just far enough away so that the heat wouldn't get too intense. That's when I heard it. First, it was faint, just a crack, a sharp snap, almost like a branch breaking under weight. I stopped breathing for a moment, listening. The wind was picking up outside, and I wondered if it had just been that, the trees swaying and creaking under the pressure of the gusts. But then it came again, a footstep, slow, deliberate. I sat up, my heart thudding in my chest. I strained my ears, listening carefully. The cabin was silent again, but the sound had been unmistakable. Someone or something was outside. I told myself it was nothing, maybe a deer or some other animal, wandering close to the cabin. But the more I thought about it, the less it seemed like that was the case. The footsteps didn't sound like an animal. They sounded too heavy, too measured. I pushed myself to my feet, feeling the cold wood beneath my bare feet as I crept toward the window. I was trying not to make a sound, but the floorboards creaked under my weight. My breath caught in my throat. I couldn't see anything through the dark, thick trees outside. The wind howled through the branches, but there was no sign of anything. No figure, no movement. I waited. A few minutes passed, and still nothing. The only sound was the wind, and the occasional snap of a branch breaking in the forest. I shook my head, trying to calm myself. This wasn't a horror story, I reminded myself. I wasn't out in the middle of nowhere to find ghosts. But still, the uneasy feeling lingered, gnawing at my nerves. I didn't sleep well that night. Every creak of the cabin, every gust of wind, every snap of a branch made my heart race. I kept hearing those footsteps in my mind. I told myself I was just imagining it, that I was overstressed and had let my mind run wild. The next day, I woke up with bags under my eyes, but the morning light brought a sense of calm. The forest was peaceful in the daylight, and the sun cast a warm glow on the cabin. I made a cup of coffee and sat by the window, staring out at the trees. I could hear the birds chirping, the occasional rustle of leaves, and the distant sound of something, maybe a squirrel or a bird, moving through the brush. It was beautiful in a way to be surrounded by all that quiet. But then, as I took another sip of my coffee, I noticed something odd. The bushes near the edge of the clearing seemed to move, just slightly, as though something had brushed past them. I froze, staring at the spot. My heart skipped a beat. Could it be a person? But no one would be out here. It had to be an animal. Yet a part of me wasn't so sure. I spent the rest of the morning unpacking and organizing. I tried to push the unease out of my mind, but it wasn't working. The sound of footsteps echoed in my thoughts. The images of shadows moving outside the window, of something lurking just beyond my view, kept creeping in. Still, I told myself I was being paranoid. The wind played tricks with your mind. The forest had its own rhythm, and when you were this far out, anything could sound like something else. By mid-afternoon, I decided to go for a walk to clear my head. I grabbed my jacket and headed out the door, into the crisp, cool air. The trees were thick, but the trail I followed was wide enough to see the ground clearly. The dirt path twisted and wound through the woods, with patches of sunlight filtering through the canopy overhead. It was peaceful, just me, the sound of my boots crunching on the earth, and the faint calls of distant birds. After about an hour of walking, I stopped to rest on a large fallen log. My legs were sore from the climb, and the quiet of the forest made it easy to lose track of time. I thought about going further, but something in the back of my mind told me I'd gone far enough. I didn't want to get lost. I turned around to head back, but something made me stop. A figure, no more than a shadow, moved at the edge of the trees. My stomach dropped. I froze, watching, my mind racing. I didn't want to make a sound, but my breath came faster. The shadow didn't move again. It was still, just standing there, like it was waiting for something. I stood there for what felt like forever, not sure what to do. But finally, after what seemed like an eternity, the figure turned and disappeared into the trees. I didn't follow it. I didn't even move for a moment, just stood there, staring into the spot where the figure had been. Then, without thinking, I walked back toward the cabin as quickly as I could. My heart was pounding in my chest, my footsteps loud on the trail. I didn't stop until I was back in the cabin, locking the door behind me. That night, I couldn't shake the feeling that something was out there. I didn't hear footsteps again, but the weight of the silence was heavier now. Every noise, every creak, felt too loud. I stayed up most of the night, staring at the fire, listening to the wind. I wanted to leave, but there was nowhere to go. The thought of driving back down the long, winding road in the dark felt worse than staying. The next morning, I packed my things early. I didn't care about the hike I had planned or the peaceful solitude I'd sought. I just wanted to get out of the cabin and back to civilization. The forest felt suffocating now, like it was closing in around me. As I packed my car, I glanced back at the cabin. It looked so small and innocent, just a building among the trees. But the memories of the past 2 days stuck with me. The shadows, the footsteps, the feeling of being watched. I never found out who or what was out there in the woods. The person I thought I saw in the trees was never found. I don't think I'll ever know for sure, but I did leave that cabin behind. And for the rest of my life, I'll never forget the quiet, the eerie stillness that filled the air, and the strange feeling that the woods were never as empty as they seemed. The old cabin sat nestled in the woods, far from the nearest road. I had found it through an online listing, a cheap getaway in the mountains, far enough from the bustle of everyday life to truly disconnect. The pictures on the website showed a cozy, rustic cabin surrounded by towering pines, a wood-burning stove, and old-world charm. They didn't show the things the camera couldn't capture, the smell of mold in the walls or the creaky, shifting foundations. But I didn't mind. I was tired, burned out, and I needed a break. I'm Ben, by the way. I'm 32, living in a small apartment in the city, working long hours at a tech startup that felt more like a hamster wheel than a career. My life was a blur of meetings, emails, and deadlines. This trip to the cabin was supposed to be my escape, a quiet week alone to decompress and recharge. I arrived on a crisp September afternoon, the sun dipping low in the sky. The drive had been long, about 6 hours, and by the time I turned off the narrow dirt road toward the cabin, my body was sore from sitting. The last few miles had been a winding, bumpy ride through the forest, where the trees closed in on both sides, almost like they were trying to swallow the road. The GPS had told me I was close, but the signal was weak out here, and I had to rely on the written directions I had printed out. The cabin itself wasn't impressive at first sight, just a simple 2-story building made of weathered wood with a shingled roof. It looked like something out of an old movie, charming but a little run down. A front porch, crooked in places, with a couple of rocking chairs on it. The wooden steps creaked under my weight as I made my way up to the door. I unlocked it with the key the owner had left for me in a lockbox by the door. The smell of musty wood and old carpet hit me immediately. It wasn't unpleasant, just old. The interior was dim, lit only by a few thin beams of light coming through the dust-covered windows. The furniture was old too. An overstuffed couch, a couple of mismatched chairs, a fireplace with logs stacked neatly by the hearth. I dumped my bag on the bed in the small upstairs bedroom and decided to make myself a drink. There was a bottle of whiskey on the counter, a gift from the cabin owner. I poured myself a glass and took a long sip, letting the warmth spread through me. The solitude of the place began to settle in, and I felt a rare sense of peace. I hadn't had a moment to myself like this in months, maybe even years. The evening passed slowly. I spent it reading a book I'd brought, sipping my whiskey, and watching the shadows grow longer outside as the sun set. By the time it got dark, the air was thick with the sounds of the forest, distant hoots of owls, the rustling of leaves in the wind, the occasional snap of a twig. It wasn't unsettling. In fact, it was kind of comforting. I decided to head to bed early, maybe get up at dawn and take a hike the next day. The room was cold, so I threw an extra blanket over the bed and turned out the lights. It didn't take long for sleep to claim me. The next morning, I woke up early, around 6, to the sharp, cold air coming through the cracks in the window. The sun hadn't fully risen, but the light was enough to illuminate the landscape outside. I could see the thick forest stretching out beyond the cabin, the trees forming a solid wall of green. I spent the day hiking the nearby trails, exploring the small streams and rocky outcrops that dotted the landscape. There was something almost therapeutic about it. The physical exertion, the smell of pine and earth, the quiet. I felt my stress and anxiety slowly ebbing away as I breathed in the clean air and let my thoughts wander. It was exactly what I needed. That evening, after a long day of hiking, I was exhausted. I sat on the porch, a hot cup of coffee in my hands, watching the sky fade to twilight. There was something serene about the place, but also something unsettling. Maybe it was just the isolation, or maybe it was the fact that I hadn't seen a single soul since I'd arrived. No other cabins nearby, no hikers on the trails, not even a passing car on the dirt road. The wind started to pick up as the night settled in, causing the trees to sway gently. It made a low, whistling sound through the branches, almost like a distant voice, but I brushed it off. Nature had a way of playing tricks on the mind. The night stretched on, and I retreated into the cabin, locking the door behind me. The fire crackled in the hearth, and I cooked a simple meal of pasta with canned tomatoes. As the warmth of the fire wrapped around me, I felt at ease, or so I thought. It was around 11 that things started to get strange. I was sitting on the couch, trying to finish a book when I heard a faint noise. It wasn't loud, just a soft thud, almost like something had fallen over upstairs. At first, I thought it was the house settling, the old wood creaking as it did every night. But then I heard it again. A series of muffled footsteps, dragging, slow and deliberate, from above me. I froze. My heart skipped a beat, but I tried to reason with myself. It was probably a raccoon or some other animal rummaging around in the attic. Maybe the roof was leaking, or there was a loose board that caused the noise. I stood up and made my way to the stairs. The cabin was dark except for the glow of the fire, casting long shadows across the room. I grabbed the flashlight I had packed in my bag and flicked it on, casting its beam down the hallway toward the staircase. The air felt cold in that hallway, colder than the rest of the house. It wasn't normal. I slowly ascended the stairs, each step creaking under my weight. When I reached the top, I checked the hallway and the 2 rooms, one of which was the bedroom I'd been sleeping in. Nothing seemed out of place, but the feeling of unease was growing, something gnawing at the edges of my mind. I returned downstairs and checked all the windows and doors, ensuring everything was locked. I wasn't sure what I was expecting to find, but I had this odd sense of being watched, like I wasn't alone. The night passed uneventfully after that. I tried to sleep but was restless. My mind kept drifting back to those noises. I eventually managed to fall into a fitful sleep. The next morning, the feeling of unease hadn't left. I went about my day as usual. Another hike, more reading, but there was a strange tension hanging in the air, as if the forest itself was holding its breath. It was about 4 in the afternoon when I heard it again. The dragging sound, this time louder, closer. It was coming from the attic. My blood ran cold. I stood motionless, listening. The house was silent except for the occasional creak of the floorboards beneath me. Then, the sound returned. Slow, dragging footsteps, deliberate and heavy. This wasn't an animal. This was something else, something human. I rushed upstairs again, my heart pounding in my chest. I grabbed a broom from the closet and stood at the foot of the attic door. It was locked from the inside. I turned the knob, but it wouldn't budge. I couldn't explain it, but I knew. Something was in there. I wasn't sure what to do, but I couldn't leave. I went back down and grabbed my phone, but the signal was still spotty out here, making it impossible to reach anyone. My only option was to leave the cabin. I packed my things quickly, grabbed my bag, and headed out the door, leaving the cabin behind me. I never looked back, but as I walked down the trail, I thought I saw a figure standing at the window, watching me. It wasn't until I got to the car, speeding away from the cabin, that I realized there had never been anyone else around. No neighbors, no people, just the woods and the eerie quiet. That was my last visit to that cabin. The next day, I found out that the owner had suddenly disappeared. No one knew where he went or why. The cabin sat vacant, untouched, a reminder of the strange, unsettling week I had spent there. I don't know who or what was in that attic, but I do know that I won't be going back. The forest, the cabin, and whatever else was in those walls, it can all stay there. Some things are bet. I didn't expect the cabin to feel so off. When I first looked at it online, I thought it would be the perfect escape. Just a weekend retreat in the woods to get away from the chaos of my day-to-day life. I'm 32, and this was my first solo trip in years. I needed the silence, the quiet, a break from everything. The cabin was listed on a rural getaway website, tucked away in the woods near a small town called Riverbend, which was a good 2-hour drive away from where I lived. It was an old place, with rough-hewn wooden walls, a stone chimney, and a wide porch that faced a dense forest. There were no neighbors for miles, which was exactly what I wanted. When I arrived that Friday afternoon, the weather was perfect. The sun hung low in the sky, casting a golden glow on the trees. I parked the car in the gravel driveway, grabbed my bags, and walked up to the front door. The steps creaked under my boots, and I could smell the musty scent of old wood as I unlocked the door. Inside, the place was smaller than I expected, but cozy. A fireplace sat at the far end of the living room, a leather couch, and a small wooden coffee table in front of it. The kitchen was basic but functional. The windows were covered in thick, dark curtains that blocked the outside world from view. I didn't think much of it at the time. I was just happy to be away from the noise. I set my bags down, went into the bathroom, and then checked out the second bedroom. It had a small, worn-out bed, the kind of place that felt like it had been slept in 100 times before. There was a wardrobe in the corner, but it was empty, except for a thin layer of dust. I spent the next few hours unpacking, enjoying the peace. I made myself some dinner, a quick pasta with whatever I had brought. The cabin didn't feel so much alive as it felt stagnant. The air was heavy, and I thought it was just because it had been closed up for a while. I cracked a window in the living room to let in some fresh air. Night fell fast, and soon I was sitting on the couch, watching the flames in the fireplace crackle. The silence was the loudest thing about the place. It wasn't peaceful. It was unsettling. There was no sound of wildlife, no breeze rustling the leaves outside. The silence pressed down on me, as though the forest itself was holding its breath. I thought I heard a sound from the back of the cabin, a creak, followed by what sounded like a faint thud. It was probably just the house settling, I told myself. But then I heard it again, this time louder, closer. A scraping noise, like something being dragged across the floor. My heart raced for a second, but I shook it off. I had rented this cabin to get away from everything. I wasn't gonna let my mind play tricks on me. I stood up, walked to the back door, and peered out. Nothing but the thick blackness of the forest. The trees stood still in the night air, and the wind had picked up, rustling the branches. I turned around, half expecting to find something. Someone behind me, but there was nothing. The place was empty, just me and the old wooden walls. I felt ridiculous standing there. It was probably just a critter, I thought. There was nothing out there that could hurt me. I was safe. I locked the back door and double-checked the windows. Then, I grabbed a book off the shelf and tried to settle back down, but the odd feeling wouldn't leave. It was as if the cabin itself was watching me. That night, I woke up in the middle of a strange dream. The sound of something scratching against the walls filled my ears. I bolted upright in bed, disoriented, heart pounding. The room was dark, the only light coming from the moon through the window. I lay there listening. The noise had stopped, but then I heard it again. This time it was coming from the direction of the bedroom door. Slowly, so slowly, I got up and grabbed the flashlight I had packed, my hands shaking. I didn't know what I expected to find. An animal, maybe? Some loose boards? I opened the bedroom door and checked the hallway. Nothing, just the silence again. I couldn't shake the feeling that something was wrong. I walked slowly down the hall, flashlight in hand. The beam of light flicked across the walls, hitting the kitchen and the living room. Everything was still. That's when I saw it. On the floor, just outside the living room, a small puddle of something dark. At first, I thought it was just water from the snow I had tracked in earlier, but as I bent down to get a closer look, I realized what it was. It was blood. I stood there, frozen for a moment, unable to process what I was seeing. My mind raced. It didn't make sense. There was no way someone had been in here. The door had been locked. The windows were shut tight. I had checked everything myself. I crouched down, shining the light closer, but the blood was already starting to dry, leaving dark smears on the wooden floor. My stomach churned. This was no accident. Something had happened here, and I was the only one who could have caused it. I backed up slowly, my mind spinning. It was then that I realized the walls were not as quiet as they had been earlier. The creaking sounds were back, but they were louder now, almost like they were coming from above or beneath. I didn't want to look, but I couldn't stop myself. I walked over to the kitchen, and the sound grew louder. It was coming from beneath the floorboards. Something was in there, something I had not noticed before. My instincts screamed at me to leave, to get out of there, but my feet were rooted to the floor. I needed to know what was happening. I grabbed the nearest heavy object I could find, a metal kettle, and slammed it against the floorboards. There was a loud crack, and the floor gave way beneath the force. What I saw was not what I had expected. A small, rotting wooden box. It was partially buried beneath the floor, sealed shut by years of dirt and dust. My heart stopped as I knelt down, prying the box free with trembling hands. The moment I opened it, the smell hit me. Sour and metallic, a pungent mixture of decay. Inside was a bundle of old, yellowed papers, wrapped in string. I knew better than to look further, but my hands moved on their own, unfolding the papers. They were photographs, old black and white pictures of people. People I didn't recognize. But the unsettling thing was the look in their eyes. Hollow, lifeless, like they had seen something they shouldn't. I didn't stay long enough to figure it out. My stomach twisted, and I felt a cold rush of fear surge through me. I backed away from the box, sealing it up again, and threw it into the corner of the room. I grabbed my things. I didn't care what was going on anymore. I needed to get out. I didn't look back as I ran to my car, my heart racing, my hands slick with sweat. The cabin receded into the dark forest behind me, and I didn't stop driving until I reached the nearest town. Weeks later, I would hear rumors about disappearances near Riverbend. People had gone missing, some found in the woods, others not at all. The local authorities couldn't explain it. No one could, but I knew what I had found in that cabin, and I was never going back. It had been a long day, but the excitement I felt about finally reaching the cabin was enough to keep me going. I had planned this trip for weeks, a solo retreat to unwind after a stressful period at work. I was 27, living in a small city up north, and I needed a break from the constant rush. The cabin was located deep in the woods, away from everything, a place where I could clear my mind. I had been driving for what felt like forever, down narrow roads that seemed to disappear into the trees. There were no other cars around, just the occasional rustling of leaves and the distant call of a bird. The deeper I went, the more isolated everything seemed, and it felt like the world was shutting out all the noise of modern life. Finally, I turned onto a gravel road that led to the cabin. The trees seemed to form a canopy overhead, blocking out the last rays of the setting sun. I slowed down, navigating through the forest until I reached the cabin, hidden in a small clearing. It was exactly what I'd imagined, a rustic, weathered wooden cabin with a stone chimney and a porch that creaked when you stepped on it. It looked old, but well-maintained, tucked away from any sign of civilization. I parked the car, grabbed my backpack, and made my way inside. The door creaked open, and the smell of old pine wood and earth filled my nose. The interior was just as charming as I had hoped. It was simple, with a few pieces of furniture, a couch, a small table, and a stone fireplace. The walls were lined with wooden paneling, and the floors were made of thick, creaky boards. There were no frills, no modern luxuries, just the basics. It was perfect. I unpacked my things, settling in for what I hoped would be a peaceful few days of solitude. The cabin had no electricity, which was exactly what I wanted. There was a wood stove for heating, a small propane stove for cooking, and oil lamps to light the place at night. I knew it would be cold once the sun went down, but I was prepared. I started a fire in the stove, the flames crackling as the room began to warm. After a while, the sun had completely dipped below the horizon, and darkness took over. The cabin felt even more secluded now, with only the flickering light of the fire to keep the shadows at bay. The only sounds were the occasional snap of wood in the fire, the rustling of the wind outside, and the distant call of an owl. I had no particular plans for the evening, so I decided to just relax, enjoy the quiet, and read a book by the fire. But as the night went on, the silence began to feel heavy. The more I tried to read, the more I became aware of the stillness surrounding me. There were no noises outside, no other sounds, just the crackling fire. It felt unnatural, like the whole forest was holding its breath. Every now and then, I thought I heard a faint noise, something soft, but it was always followed by complete silence again. The hairs on the back of my neck began to prickle. I told myself I was just being paranoid, that it was probably an animal, maybe a deer or a raccoon, wandering too close. Still, something about the way the silence enveloped the cabin made me uneasy. I decided to get up and close the windows, even though there was no real reason to think someone or something could get inside. The windows were old, with thick glass, and I could see the moonlight filtering through the trees outside. I made sure everything was locked and double-checked the door. There was a sense of security in the mundane actions, but as I sat back down by the fire, I couldn't shake the feeling that I wasn't alone. The night went on, and I eventually fell asleep on the couch, wrapped in a thick wool blanket. The fire had burned down to a few glowing embers, casting soft, red shadows on the walls. I woke up suddenly, jolted from my sleep by a loud noise outside. Something had crashed in the woods. I shot upright, heart racing, listening intently. I could hear the wind picking up outside, rustling the leaves, but that sound had been accompanied by something heavier, a thud or the snap of branches. It was too close to be anything natural. I waited, holding my breath, as the sound faded into the distance. After a few moments, I stood up and cautiously moved toward the window. I peeked out but saw nothing in the darkness. The moonlight illuminated the clearing around the cabin, but the woods beyond were thick and impenetrable. Nothing seemed out of place. I told myself it was just an animal, maybe a bear or a wild boar, wandering through the forest at night. The noise had been unsettling, but I had to remind myself that I was in the middle of nowhere, and it was normal for wildlife to make strange sounds. Still, I locked the door again, just in case, and went back to bed, pulling the blanket tightly around me. I had been shaken, but I was determined to get some sleep. The next morning, I woke up to the smell of fresh pine and morning dew. The cabin was quiet again, and the sun had risen, casting a golden light through the trees. I stretched and made my way to the small kitchen area to start brewing some coffee. The events of the night still lingered in my mind, but the morning light helped push those thoughts aside. I spent the day exploring the area around the cabin. The forest was vast, with thick trees and a few small creeks running through the woods. The air was fresh, and the scent of pine filled my lungs with every breath. I found a small trail leading deeper into the forest and decided to follow it for a while. It was peaceful out there, with only the occasional bird or squirrel darting through the trees. I couldn't help but feel at ease, the anxiety of last night fading with each step. When I returned to the cabin in the late afternoon, I found something strange. The door was slightly ajar. I was sure I had locked it before I left, but now it was open, just a crack. My heart skipped a beat as I stepped forward cautiously, half expecting to see someone inside. But the cabin was empty, just as I had left it. I closed the door and locked it again, my mind racing. There was no reason for the door to have been opened. I hadn't seen anyone out in the woods, and there were no signs of forced entry. But the unsettling feeling was back. I couldn't shake the thought that I was being watched or that someone, or something, was out there. I decided to stay inside that night, making sure everything was locked and secured. I cooked a simple dinner, trying to distract myself from the anxiety creeping in. But as the night wore on, the silence again felt oppressive. The wind had picked up, howling outside the cabin. The fire in the stove crackled, but there was an underlying tension in the air. Every now and then, I would hear a faint creak from the floorboards or the sound of something scraping against the walls. I stood up from the couch, feeling the weight of the fear in my chest. I walked to the window once more, peering out into the dark. The wind swirled through the trees, making the shadows dance, but there was no one in sight. Nothing. Yet the feeling of being watched lingered, heavy and suffocating. I decided I couldn't stay another night in this place. I had made up my mind. There was something off about this cabin, something that I couldn't explain, and I wasn't going to stick around to figure it out. I gathered my things in a hurry, trying not to let the panic overwhelm me. The thought of driving back down that lonely gravel road made my heart race, but I knew I couldn't stay. The cabin had started to feel less like a retreat and more like a trap. With one final glance around the room, I stepped outside, locked the door behind me, and walked quickly to my car. The forest seemed even darker now, the trees looming over me like silent watchers. I got in the car and started the engine, my hands shaking. As I drove away from the cabin, I looked into the rearview mirror, half expecting to see something in the distance. But all I saw was the dark, empty road. By the time I reached the main highway, the fear that had gripped me began to loosen. The cabin was behind me, the woods fading in the distance. The unsettling silence, the creaks and whispers of the night. None of it mattered anymore. I had made it out. Looking back, I still don't know what happened that night. Maybe it was just my mind playing tricks on me, the isolation making everything seem more eerie than it actually was. But I'll never forget the feeling that something wasn't right. The silence was too loud, the forest too still. As I drove home, I realized that I had left something behind in that cabin. A sense of peace, perhaps, but more importantly, a lesson about trusting my instincts. I'd gone there looking for solitude and clarity, but in the end, I found something much deeper. The reminder that not everything is as it seems, and sometimes, leaving is the only choice that makes sense. The wind was heavy that evening, thick and biting. It had started around noon, a light breeze turning into something more powerful as the day stretched on. By the time I reached the cabin, it felt as if the whole forest was holding its breath, the kind of silence that only exists in places far from civilization. That silence, punctuated only by the occasional gust of wind scraping against the tree trunks. I'd always been someone who loved the outdoors, the kind of person who found peace in isolation. So when I decided to spend the weekend alone in a small cabin just outside of Bear Valley, I wasn't thinking about the fact that I hadn't been in a cabin like this before. The cabin was old, a small wooden structure that looked like it had been standing for decades. It had a faded red paint job that clung to the wood as though it too was tired. The surrounding forest, thick with pine and birch trees, seemed to close in around it, offering little light through its dense branches. I parked my car at the foot of the long dirt driveway and grabbed my bags. The path to the cabin was not well maintained, which made sense given how few people came out this far. As I walked the narrow trail, each step seemed to sink a little more into the earth, the wet ground from yesterday's rain adding weight to my shoes. The wind carried a scent of pine needles and damp earth, but there was something else in the air, something that made me uneasy. A smell, faint but noticeable, like wet metal or something rusted. The cabin itself was surprisingly cozy once I stepped inside. It smelled of old wood and a faint hint of mildew. The fireplace was the focal point, its stone hearth dark and cold. The single window near the door showed nothing but the dense trees outside, and the small kitchen nook with its chipped tiles and old appliances had an air of abandonment. But it was quiet, and that was what I was looking for. The peace of being alone, away from the world for a little while. I didn't plan to do much that evening. Just a quiet dinner, maybe a book, and an early night. It wasn't until I started unpacking that I noticed the first odd thing. At the back of the cabin, in the corner behind a faded armchair, was a small door. The kind that was probably meant to be a closet or pantry, but there were no shelves inside. Just a dark space that felt unnaturally empty. I figured it must have been a storage room of some kind, but it was strange that it was so hidden, tucked away in a corner where no one would notice. After a few moments, I decided to ignore it. I had more pressing matters to attend to. I went about making myself dinner, a simple pasta dish that I could cook in the small kitchenette. The wind howled outside, the trees creaking in response. There was something oddly comforting about the sound of the wind, like the world outside was 1,000 miles away. The darkness came quickly, as it always does in the woods. The shadows crept across the floor of the cabin, growing longer as the light from my small lantern flickered. I felt the weight of the silence again, even as I ate. It wasn't normal. It wasn't peaceful silence. It was as though the world had stopped just for me, leaving the forest outside and the cabin within in a strange stasis. After dinner, I cleaned up quickly and then settled on the couch near the fireplace. I had a book with me, a worn paperback that I had brought along for the trip. I tried to focus on the words, but I found my mind wandering. It was hard to shake the feeling that I wasn't entirely alone. The wind had picked up again, now stronger than before, and I could hear it pushing against the cabin, rattling the windows and door. Every so often, the house seemed to groan under the pressure. I thought it was just the wind, but there was something unsettling about the sound. It was when I stood up to fetch some water that I saw it again, the small door in the back of the cabin. It stood slightly ajar now. I hadn't opened it, In fact, I had made sure to check it when I first arrived, and it had been shut tight. But there it was, cracked open by maybe half an inch. My heart skipped a beat, and I stood frozen for a second, trying to make sense of it. It was probably nothing. Maybe the wind had somehow pushed it open, or maybe I had forgotten to close it all the way. I told myself that was all it was and decided to go over and shut it. But when I got closer, something felt off. I don't know how to explain it. It wasn't like I could see anything unusual. The air felt cooler around the door, like it was somehow pulling heat from the rest of the room. My fingers brushed against the frame, and for a split second, I felt something soft and warm, almost like a hand grazing mine. I jerked back, heart pounding. I told myself it was just my nerves. I'd been alone for too long, hadn't slept well the night before, and the isolation was starting to mess with my head. I closed the door quickly and locked it, then went back to the couch. I tried to distract myself with my book again, but the silence pressed on me more than before. Every creak of the cabin seemed magnified. Every gust of wind felt like something far more deliberate. The fire had almost gone out by now, and I knew I should probably tend to it, but I couldn't bring myself to get up. I don't know how much time passed. Maybe an hour, maybe more. I must have drifted into a light sleep because I was startled awake by the sound of something heavy thudding against the floor, coming from the direction of the small door. I froze. It was too loud to be the wind. It was as if something or someone had dropped something heavy inside. I felt the hairs on the back of my neck stand up. There was no logical explanation for it, but I had a feeling deep in my gut that something was wrong. I stood up slowly, trying to make as little noise as possible. My legs were shaky, but I forced myself to move toward the door, the only thing I could focus on. The air in the cabin felt thick, suffocating. The wind had died down and everything was still, too still. When I reached the door, I hesitated, my hand hovering over the knob. I didn't want to open it. I knew I shouldn't, but my curiosity, combined with the gnawing feeling in my gut, made me twist the handle and push it open. The room beyond was dark, too dark to make out much, but I could feel the coolness of the air seeping out, the chill almost like a warning. I stepped inside, heart pounding. The space was small, with wooden beams overhead and dust that seemed to swirl in the faint light from the main cabin. But as I stepped deeper, something in the corner caught my eye. It was a shape, something huddled in the shadows, barely visible. I couldn't tell what it was at first, but as my eyes adjusted to the darkness, I realized with a jolt that it was a bundle of old, tattered clothes lying on the floor in the corner of the room. My first thought was that someone had left them here long ago, but then I saw something else. On top of the clothes, a series of deep scratches in the wood. Not random, but deliberate. The marks were fresh. I didn't want to look closer, but I couldn't stop myself. As I took a step forward, I noticed something that sent a shiver down my spine. There were footprints, small, faint impressions in the dust, leading out of the corner and toward the door I had just opened. I was no longer alone. My stomach twisted into knots as the full weight of the situation hit me. I wasn't alone in the cabin, and I wasn't alone in the woods. I could hear a faint rustling sound behind me, barely audible, but enough to send me into a full panic. I turned quickly, but there was nothing there, only the empty, dark cabin. The air seemed to press in on me, the silence more suffocating now than before. I had to leave. I had to get out. I turned and ran to the front door, stumbling over the floorboards, heart racing. The door slammed open with a force I hadn't intended, and I burst outside into the cold night air. The moon was full, its pale light cutting through the trees. I didn't look back. I just ran, through the trees, over the rough terrain, not stopping until I reached the car. My hands were shaking as I fumbled with the keys, but eventually, I got the engine to turn over. I didn't look back. I didn't stop until I was hours away from that cabin, from Bear Valley, from whatever was hiding out there. I don't know if I'll ever understand what happened that night, or if I ever want to, but I know one thing. That cabin was never meant to be my peace. I never thought I'd be spending the weekend at a remote cabin, far from civilization. But here I was, standing in front of it, staring up at the old wood structure surrounded by dense trees. It was mid-October, 2025. The air was crisp, and the ground had that damp, earthy smell of a fall day just after a light rain. The trees were shifting from vibrant green to shades of yellow and orange, their leaves covering the ground in a thick carpet. I'm Mark, 29 years old, from a small town just outside of Boston. I'm the type of guy who normally likes the city, crowded streets, a constant hum of noise. But my brother, Jake, who's always been the outdoorsy one, had been asking me to join him on a cabin trip for years. This time, I finally agreed. A weekend in a cabin seemed like it could be an escape from my usual routine. Something simple and quiet, away from the pressure of work. When I arrived, Jake was already there, unloading his gear from his old Jeep. He'd been to this cabin a few times before and told me it was secluded. No neighbors, just a peaceful spot to unwind. The cabin itself was weathered, with a few cracks in the walls, but sturdy. A small wood-burning stove sat next to the kitchen, and the windows were wide enough to let in the warmth of the sun in the day and provide a good view of the woods at night. Inside, the cabin smelled like old wood and pine. There was a small living room area with a couple of mismatched chairs, a thick, worn rug on the floor, and a stone fireplace that looked like it hadn't been used in years. The kitchen was simple: a gas stove, an old-fashioned sink, and a small fridge that hummed constantly. It didn't seem like much, but there was a certain charm to the place. Jake had already set up his sleeping bag in the corner of the living room, and I decided to claim the loft. It was small, but it had a good view through the narrow window that overlooked the forest. After unpacking my stuff, we went outside to sit on the porch. The quiet was overwhelming at first. I couldn't get over how still it was. The only sound was the rustling of the trees in the wind and the occasional chirp of a distant bird. "We'll be fine," Jake said, almost reading my thoughts. "No one comes out here, just the way I like it." That evening, we built a fire outside, sitting around it as the temperature dropped. The light from the fire flickered in the shadows of the trees, casting long, eerie shapes on the ground. We drank beers, ate some snacks, and talked about everything and nothing. As the night deepened, the forest seemed to grow quieter, like it was holding its breath. I don't know why, but I started feeling a little uneasy. It wasn't the forest itself. I've spent time in places like this before. It was something else. Maybe it was the isolation, the complete absence of other people, or the way the darkness felt almost thick. That night, as I lay in the loft, I couldn't shake the feeling that I was being watched. I brushed it off as nerves, something that was bound to happen in a place like this. The wind outside had picked up, and the trees groaned and creaked, making the whole place feel like it was alive. Around 3 a.m., I woke up to the sound of something moving outside. It wasn't the usual creaks or groans of the cabin settling. This was something different, something deliberate. It wasn't a squirrel or a deer. It was too heavy for that. My heart started to race as I strained to listen, the sound growing louder. It was like footsteps crunching in the leaves. I pulled the blanket over my head, telling myself it was just an animal, maybe a bear. But then I heard it again, a scraping noise, followed by what sounded like someone dragging something across the ground. My stomach knotted, and my mind raced through every possible scenario. I wasn't sure what to do. Could be a person out there, someone who'd wandered too far from the trail, or someone with bad intentions. I waited for what felt like an eternity, listening to the sounds from outside, but they stopped as suddenly as they had started. The only sound now was the wind rustling the leaves and the occasional creak of the cabin. I couldn't shake the sense that something was wrong, so I decided to stay awake, listening carefully for any more signs of movement. At sunrise, I got up and went outside. The air was cold, and a light fog hung over the forest. Everything seemed normal at first, no sign of anyone or anything unusual. But as I walked around the cabin, I noticed something odd. The dirt by the back door was disturbed, like someone had been walking around the perimeter of the cabin during the night. I knelt down, examining the ground, but there were no footprints, just the trampled earth. "Jake!" I called out, my voice shaky. "Hey, Jake, you awake?" He came out of the cabin, stretching. "What's up? Did you hear anything last night? Or see anyone?" I asked, my voice low. Jake gave me a puzzled look. "No, I didn't hear anything." "Why?" "I thought I heard someone outside," I said, still looking around. He shrugged, not taking it seriously. "Probably just an animal. You know how it gets out here." But I wasn't convinced. The more I thought about it, the more uneasy I felt. I wanted to leave, to drive back to town, but something kept me there. Jake was fine with everything, and he was right. Nothing had actually happened. Still, there was a sense of tension that I couldn't shake. We spent the day hiking through the woods. It wasn't far from the cabin, just a simple trail that wound through the trees and over a small creek. The fresh air and exercise helped clear my mind, and by the time we returned, the feeling of unease had started to fade. The sun was setting, and we started a fire outside again. The crackling of the flames and the warm glow were comforting, and I found myself finally relaxing. That night, I slept better than I had the previous night, despite the uneasiness that had plagued me. I woke up once or twice, listening to the wind, but there was no strange scraping sound, no heavy footsteps outside. Everything seemed peaceful. By morning, I was feeling more like myself, but when I went outside to get some fresh air, I noticed something strange. The back door had been left open. I was sure I had locked it the night before. I walked over to it, my heart beating faster now. I checked the inside of the cabin. Nothing appeared out of place, but there was a definite sense that something was wrong. I asked Jake if he'd gone outside, but he said no. No one else had been there. The more I thought about it, the more certain I became that someone had been around the cabin. Someone who knew the area and had been watching us. It wasn't until we packed up to leave that I found something that made my blood run cold. As I was loading the last of my gear into the car, I found a small, weathered knife under one of the steps leading up to the porch. It wasn't mine, and it wasn't Jake's. I stared at it for a long time, trying to make sense of what had happened. Maybe it was an animal, maybe it was someone just passing through. But I knew one thing: someone had been out there. We left the cabin that afternoon, and I haven't been back since. But I'll never forget that feeling, the sense that we weren't as alone as we thought. It was the kind of experience that stays with you, gnawing at the back of your mind long after you've left the place behind. The weather had been bad for days, pouring rain without any sign of letting up. The kind of downpour that made everything dark, heavy, and oppressive. It was late October when I decided to take a trip to the cabin I'd inherited from my uncle. A small, secluded place in the Appalachian Mountains of North Carolina, tucked away in the woods. I hadn't been there in years, not since I was a kid. Back then, it was a place for family reunions and summer vacations, but now, as a 29-year-old, I figured it would be a good escape from the busy pace of everyday life. I arrived late in the afternoon, the sky a thick sheet of gray. The rain made the road slick, and the car tires kicked up mud as I drove down the narrow, dirt road leading to the cabin. The trees were so dense here, the kind that seemed to stretch on forever. The cabin itself was nestled in a small clearing, barely visible from the road. The old wooden structure looked tired and weathered, but it was still sturdy enough. The paint was peeling, the roof was covered in moss, and the chimney stood tall against the dreary backdrop of trees. I grabbed my bags from the trunk of the car and made my way to the door, trying to avoid the puddles that had formed on the ground. The air felt thick with moisture, and I was glad to finally get inside and out of the rain. The interior smelled musty, like old wood and mildew, but it was cozy. A small stone fireplace sat against the far wall, and a large window overlooked the woods outside. The furniture was old but comfortable. A couple of chairs, a wooden table, and a couch with faded cushions. The place had a quiet charm to it, though it was a little dusty from being vacant for so long. I set my things down and took a moment to breathe in the quiet. It was so peaceful out here, far from the noise and chaos of the city. I started a fire in the hearth, watching the flames crackle as the heat began to warm the room. The sound of the rain hitting the roof was rhythmic, almost soothing, as I settled in for the evening. I was alone, of course. I hadn't invited anyone. a retreat into solitude, a time to reflect, to disconnect. The idea of being alone in such a remote place was appealing, even if a little eerie. I'd always been a bit on edge when I stayed here, especially at night. There was something about the silence, the isolation, that made the mind wander. The dark woods surrounding the cabin seemed endless, and in the past, I'd always had the nagging feeling that something was out there, something just beyond the trees. The rain continued to fall in sheets as the evening wore on, and I lost track of time, my eyes heavy from the warmth of the fire. It was around midnight when I woke up from an accidental nap. The fire had burned down to embers, and the room was much colder than before. I stood up and tossed another log onto the fire, watching as it flared up, casting long shadows across the walls. I didn't want to go to bed just yet. The silence was unnerving. I kept hearing little creaks and groans from the cabin, the house settling into the night. The wind howled outside, making the trees shake. But there was something else, something subtle, like a distant thud or scrape against the cabin. My mind was quick to dismiss it as the storm, the branches hitting the roof or the side of the house, but I couldn't help but listen closer. The sound came again, a sharp scrape, then another. I froze. It wasn't the wind. This sound was deliberate, like someone was trying to get my attention. I grabbed a flashlight from the kitchen counter and slowly moved toward the door. The floorboards creaked beneath my feet, and I winced at every step. I peered through the window but saw nothing, just the storm outside and the dark shape of the trees. I couldn't shake the feeling that someone or something was out there. I stood there for a moment, gathering the courage to open the door. But then I heard it again, a soft scraping sound, like nails on wood, followed by a rustle, as though something was moving around the porch. I knew I was alone. I had been since I arrived, and the thought of anyone else being out there in such a remote place made my heart race. It had to be an animal, I thought, probably a raccoon or some other critter. I told myself not to be paranoid, but the doubt lingered. I opened the door slowly, shining the flashlight onto the porch. There was nothing there. The rain fell in sheets, and the only sound was the rustling of the trees. I exhaled, relieved, but as I turned to close the door, I noticed something odd. A small, wet footprint in the mud just outside the threshold. It was clear, fresh, and unmistakable. I stared at it for a moment. It wasn't the print of an animal. It was too human. I quickly slammed the door shut and locked it. My heart was pounding in my chest. I backed away from the door, trying to think. Who could it have been? There was no way anyone could have come this far out in the storm. I was miles from the nearest neighbor. I grabbed the phone from the table, but there was no signal. Of course, there wasn't. The cabin was in the middle of nowhere, far from any cell towers. I checked the windows, looking out into the dark woods. But all I could see was the rain, pouring down in sheets, and the trees swaying in the wind. I was still on edge, the unsettling feeling in my gut growing. I grabbed a kitchen knife from the counter, though I wasn't sure what good it would do me. I wasn't really afraid of a person, not exactly, but the thought of something or someone being out there so close to the cabin was making my mind race. What if they were watching me? What if they were waiting for the right moment to come in? The night dragged on. Every little noise made me jump. I kept hearing strange sounds from outside, but each time I checked, there was nothing there. I thought about barricading the doors and windows, but it seemed silly, almost paranoid. I tried to tell myself it was just my imagination running wild, but I couldn't shake the sense of danger. Around 2 a.m., I finally gave in to exhaustion and decided to go to bed. I pulled the covers over my head and tried to sleep, but every time I closed my eyes, I could hear the faintest sound, scraping, tapping, rustling. I couldn't tell where it was coming from. It sounded close, but maybe it was just the wind. At some point, I must have dozed off because I woke up to the sound of something thumping against the door. My heart jumped into my throat, and I sat up in bed, my breath shallow. The storm had let up, but the silence now was even worse, amplifying every small sound. I grabbed the flashlight and crept toward the door, my fingers gripping the handle. I swung it open quickly, shining the light around the porch again. There was nothing. No one. Just the remnants of the storm, wet ground, damp air, and the smell of pine. I closed the door behind me and leaned against it, trying to calm myself down. It had to be my nerves. I was alone out here in the middle of nowhere. The idea of anyone being so close of being watched was irrational. But that's when I noticed something else. The footprint was gone. It wasn't there anymore. I checked the ground, the porch, but there was nothing. It was as if it had never been there at all. A wave of confusion washed over me. My mind was playing tricks, or so I tried to convince myself. But deep down, I knew I hadn't imagined it. I stayed up the rest of the night, watching the door and keeping my eyes on every little movement outside. But nothing else happened. No more footsteps, no more rustling. By morning, the rain had stopped and the sky had cleared. The world outside was quiet, peaceful, as if nothing had ever happened. I didn't stay another night. I packed up and left that morning, the sight of the cabin growing smaller in my rearview mirror. I didn't tell anyone about what happened. I wasn't sure how to explain it. Maybe I'd been paranoid. Maybe it was all just in my head. But the thing that stayed with me wasn't the fear. It was the feeling of being watched, of something unseen moving just out of sight. And as I drove away, I couldn't shake the thought that someone had been out there. Maybe they were still out there,